All right, we're going to talk open houses and answer this question once and for all. Do you need a buyer agreement when doing open houses? Now, we're going to cover 3 different types of open houses so that you are absolutely crystal clear on what the requirements are. 3 different things. First, you're doing an open house on your own listing. Second, you're doing an open house on another agent in your brokerage on their listing. And third, you're doing an open house for an agent in some other brokerage. It's outside of your firm. Do you need a buyer agreement in any of these 3 scenarios? Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go through and give you the reasoning in 3 different ways about buyer agreements and open houses. I'm going to give you all the information where to find it, and then I'm going to come back and answer yes or no on all 3 of these situations.
So here's the deal. Sometimes you get information that isn't exactly accurate, and it happens. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of different perspectives. So I want you to trust but verify every time you get information from somebody, including me, because there's a whole lot of people, even like me, that are holding ourselves out as experts on all these industry changes and things going on. And you need to be careful because you're going to get some conflicting information. That's why when we talk about open houses right now, I'm going to guide you through 3 different pieces of analysis as to my answers on whether you need open house buyer agreements on all different types of open houses. So bear with me because I'm going to take you through, first of all, some of the information that NAR has put out in their consumer guides. Second of all, we're going to look at these specific MLS rule changes that NAR said that we had to implement as Realtor MLSs. And third, we're going to look at the settlement itself. And by the end of that, when I give you my answers, yes or no, I think you're going to agree with me about what my conclusion is. And if not, at least you understand the analysis as to how I got my answers. So the first thing we're going to do is look at a couple of consumer guides from NAR. And I want to point out in the very first one that we're going to look at is a home buyer's guide from NAR. They've put out a number of these consumer guides over at facts.realtor, and they're very helpful. But check this out. This first one is home buyers. What does the NAR settlement mean for you? Well, check this out. Let's scroll down here towards the bottom. It says right here, you do not need a written agreement if you are just speaking to an agent at an open house or asking them about their services. Now, I want you to understand and walk through me with this because words matter. NAR is here producing guides that says, look, buyer, if you're at an open house, you don't need to get a buyer agreement signed. They're telling the consumer, you're not going to have to sign one if you're talking to an agent at an open house. It doesn't say, well, it depends on what that agent is doing and who they're hosting the open house for. It doesn't say that, but let's keep going because there's more. The second consumer guide I want to take you through is a specific one that NAR put out for consumers on open houses and written agreements. Let's take a look at what this one says. It says, look, I'm attending an open house without an agent. Do I need a written buyer agreement in order to tour the home? Very first question. And it says, no. If you are simply visiting an open house on your own or asking a real estate professional about their services, you do not need to sign a written buyer agreement. All right, we've got 2 pieces of consumer guide information from NAR where they are telling consumers, no, you do not need to sign a buyer agreement. This is important, right? Because it doesn't make sense for a buyer to walk in and it's in, well, it depends. Are you working for the listing agent? Are you the listing agent? Are you from another brokerage? And each one of those, well, then it kind of depends on whether you have to get a buyer agreement signed or not. None of that makes sense. That doesn't make sense for consumers. It doesn't make sense for us. And so at least we see support in the consumer guides that NAR is putting out that says, no, buyers do not have to sign buyer agreements when walking into an open house, period. Doesn't say if you're hosting an open house for somebody else or those kinds of things. So we'll get back to that. But at least at the outset, we see the consumer information that's being put out from NAR is saying, no, you don't have to get a buyer agreement signed when you walk into an open house. Cool. That's the first piece of analysis that I want you to follow me through. The second thing, let's take a look at the actual MLS rule changes that NAR has put out here. Okay, so first of all, we've got this summary of all the rule changes. And down here at the bottom, we understand that it says that we do have to require MLS participants working with a buyer to enter into a written agreement with a buyer prior to touring a home. Great, we know this, right? Got to get a buyer agreement before touring a home. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper because these are the actual rule changes. This little red M down here means this is a mandatory change for written buyer agreements that all the MLSs that are a part to this, they have to get done. And here's exactly what it says. That all MLS participants working with a buyer must enter into a written agreement prior to touring a home. Again, we just mentioned that. We know that. Here's the thing. This does not say all buyers have to sign a written agreement before touring a home, right? Because is an open house a buyer touring a home? Yes, it is. There's a second piece here. MLS participants working with a buyer. This is the part that keeps getting missed. It's two pieces to it. It's not just the when. The when is I have to get a buyer agreement signed before touring a home. But the why, the behind that is the when working with a buyer. Now look, this is really important to understand that this is a two-part analysis. It's not just touring a home, but it's also when working with a buyer. Working with is part one. Part two is now that I'm working with them, I have to get that buyer agreement signed before touring a home. So again, there's two parts here. You have to get buyer agreement signed when you're working with a buyer. And the last moment that that can be is before touring a home. Now you might say, how do you get there? How do you understand this? Well, look, I've gone through every single word of NAR's FAQ that they put out, all 100 of them. And look, they've addressed this. Question 73 in facts.realtor, it says the practice change requiring written agreements is triggered by two conditions. Two conditions. It only applies to MLS participants working with buyers and is triggered by touring a home. We're not hearing people out there talk about this stuff and mention this piece. They're just saying every buyer has to get a buyer agreement signed and when they tour a home and oh, an open house is touring a home. But there's this little exception carved out for if you're doing your own listing. That's not what it is. The real reason why you don't have to get a buyer agreement signed to show your own listing is because at that moment, you're not working with the buyer. You're working with the seller and you're still trying to get that house sold because it doesn't fit the two-part analysis here. Yes, that buyer's touring a home. And so that would be a threshold for I got to get it signed, but you haven't met the first requirement of actually working with that buyer yet. So let's see what this goes on to say because it says the working with language is intended to distinguish MLS participants who provide these services such as identifying properties, arranging for the buyer to tour the property, performing negotiations from MLS participants who simply market their services or just talk to a buyer, like at an open house, or providing an unrepresented buyer access to a house they have listed. This is good stuff. This is good stuff because this answers the questions that people have been having and unfortunately sometimes been getting bad information about. When you're hosting an open house, it doesn't matter who you're working for, right? The listing agent, the seller, the whatever. The question is, are you working with every single buyer that comes in the door, right? And when we say this working with, again, it says working with means things as identifying properties for them, negotiating for the buyer, arranging for the buyer to tour properties, doing things for the buyer at the request of the buyer or because you have a service agreement with them. And it doesn't matter who you're hosting the open house for because those buyers, you aren't working with them, right? You can't force a buyer to be working with you, right? And they want to come into the open house. And so to say, we got to sign a buyer agreement, it's like, well, no, they're not working with you yet. Maybe you would like that. Yes, I understand we do open houses for a lot of different reasons, one of which is lead generation, right? That's one of the things that you want to do is hopefully you do get to start working with a buyer, but you're not when they walk in the door. And so there's no requirements to get a buyer agreement signed. And simply talking to them at an open house or talking to them about your services is not working with that buyer. Working with is providing real brokerage services to them. And so when you're sitting in an open house, you're not doing that yet. And you got to think through this kind of logically too. Does it even make sense? Because what if the buyer that walks in already has an agent? Well, you're still showing them the house. So does that mean you have to get a buyer agreement signed? Well, if they have one signed with somebody else, you can't. That'd be a violation of Article 16 of the Code of Ethics, interfering with another realtor's exclusive relationships. And so that's weird, right? This doesn't make sense. It's illogical. And I think we do have to think through this. Of remember, at the end of the day, while we can argue about whether they actually have effectively been good for consumers or not, the purpose was to make sense logically to do good for a consumer. And so having this weird, I just want to walk into an open house and now we got to figure out, well, is the agent working for the seller? Are they the listing agent? Are they somebody else? And oh, does this buyer have a buyer agreement? Do they not with somebody else? None of that makes any sense at all. We got to start just putting a little logic behind this. We've got to stop overcomplicating it. And we got to go through the third piece of this as well, just to actually make sure we feel really comfortable. Because first of all, we went through the consumer stuff that NAR's put out. Nothing says buyers have to get buyer agreements signed for open house. It says they don't. Second, we looked at the MLS rules that say when working with the buyer, then you have to get a buyer agreement signed no later than prior to touring a home. And we looked specifically to support that in the NAR FAQ that defined what working with a buyer actually means. Now, the third piece we're going to go through is, you know what this is? This is the actual settlement itself. This is all 100 and however many pages here, 116 pages of the settlement agreement. And just to be absolutely clear, I want to make sure, does this address open houses? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Control Find here, and I'm going to search for open, just the word open. And there's 7 different pieces where, 7 different instances of it saying open. And I'm going to click all of them. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. None of those say anything about an open house, right? There's nothing in the settlement language itself that says anything about open houses. So that's our third piece of support about all the answers that we have on whether we need buyer agreements signed. So let's go back to the drawing board, the literal drawing board I have, the whiteboard. Let's go back to it and answer this final question once and for all.
Okay, first of all, I know that the whiteboard's not hung up and I'm sitting on the floor. Whatever, I'm gonna get it hung up eventually. We moved in like 6 months ago and I haven't hung it yet. Whatever. So let's answer this final question. Again, we went over 3 different pieces of analysis and there's 3 different types of open houses that we got to question whether we need a buyer agreement. So first of all, your listing, do you need one? Everyone's pretty clear on this one that no, you don't. Absolutely not. If you are doing an open house on your listing, you do not need to get a buyer agreement signed. Now, what if you're doing a open house for another agent in your brokerage? So you're not the listing agent, but it's your brokerage, somebody else's. Do you need a buyer agreement signed? No, you don't. Everyone's pretty clear on that one too. That's been asked quite a bit and people were pretty clear on that. But now we've got this third one of if you're doing an open house for another brokerage, somebody that's not in your brokerage, it's not your listing, it's not your broker's listing. It's another brokerage altogether, somebody else's firm. And so the question is, do I need to get a buyer agreement signed? No, you don't. Why? Remember, everything NAR has put out, it says when a buyer walks into an open house, they do not need to get a buyer agreement signed. It doesn't matter which one of these 3 scenarios it is, they don't have to get a buyer agreement signed. Second of all, we looked at the MLS rules and the language, what it means to be working with a buyer. Remember, it's a 2-part analysis. It's not just touring a home, because yes, is an open house a buyer touring a home? Absolutely. And are you sitting there? For sure. But are you working with that buyer? And the answer is no, because you haven't been negotiating for that buyer. You haven't been scheduling showings for that buyer. You haven't been providing any services to that buyer. So you're not working with the buyer. So that means no, you don't need it. And third, we looked at the settlement itself, which doesn't even address open houses. Bottom line is, if you're doing open houses, you don't need to get buyer agreements signed.